We have an inconvenient truth in this country, and one of those inconvenient truths is that we're a multilingual country. We have 7,000 languages in the world, 6,000 to 7,000 languages. There are almost 400 languages in the United States, and what we also conveniently forget sometimes is 160 of those are indigenous languages that were here before English ever arrived. There are about 25 million limited English proficient people in the United States. That is about 9% of our population. In Idaho, there are about 60,000 limited English proficient persons, about 4% of our population, so we're a little bit below average for the rest of the country. In more than 10% of the households in Idaho, a language other than English is spoken in that home. When I looked at school districts here in the Treasure Valley, I found 80 to 100 languages in the Boise School District, 58 in Meridian, 12 in Canyon County, and 21 in Twin Falls. And it's hard to see that question with the color scheme that I've chosen, but there are some implications to that. And that is that these children's parents are probably limited English proficient themselves. And those people may be the same people that will be greeting you and meeting you across the desk one day. And you, if you're dealing with a federally assisted program or service, or in the case of affordable housing, that you have to know how to address that so you do not violate their civil rights. There are also what are called linguistically isolated households. That's where nobody over 14 speaks English very well. That's about 2% of Idaho's households. That's more than 1 in 5 of the Spanish-speaking households in the state. This is a little bit old information, but the city of Boise does what's called an analysis of impediments to fair housing, and in that analysis at the time they found that refugees received less than what you'd call perfect language assistance. And the city is in the process of updating this information. Hopefully they'll be looking at this again and seeing if there's been an improvement. There's some legal underpinnings for what I'm for the rest of the presentation that I need to explain to you. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act basically says that federally assisted, federally funded programs and services need to be offered without discrimination. And that includes based on national origin, which includes to those people that are limited English proficient. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case, had nothing to do with housing or community development, had to do with the San Francisco School District, where basically, on behalf of students who were non-English speakers, there was a lawsuit filed against the school district that said essentially that these students were denied an education because all instruction and all materials were provided in English only. And the court decided that they were in fact correct. President Clinton in 2000 issued an executive order that directed all federal agencies to address limited English proficiency in their policies and practices, and to issue guidance to those entities that they would fund. So there's, behind all of this, there are federal agency guidelines, limited English proficiency guidelines. HUD issued theirs in 2007. USDA issued draft guidance, I think about 3 years ago. It's still in draft, hasn't been finalized, and that may be true of other federal agencies. The thing that you need to know if you happen to be receiving funds from that federal agency, then in spite of the fact that the more specific guidance hasn't been issued, you are still subject to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. I told everybody yesterday, and I'll tell everybody today, I love these slides. This is a couple of views of what equality looks like. This happens to be how the limited English proficiency guidance is written. Essentially what it's saying is, in order to help a person have equal access to these programs and services that are federally assisted, that there may be different levels of language assistance that needs to be provided. For instance, there may be, and you need to up your game based on the needs of the person. So there may be a person that you can have a conversation with in English, but is only literate in Spanish and could not read a loan document or a lease agreement or any other kind of program agreement that might go along with your federally assisted program. So you have to up your game. If that person also has a disability on top of that, you need to think about that. So you need to, in order to make it so that people have equal access, which is the intention, that you may have to up your game depending, again, on the needs of the person that you're dealing with. What is limited English proficiency? Well, that's when somebody's primary language is something other than English, and that they read, write, speak, or understand English, or have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. And they may be considered limited English proficient or LEP, and I'll use those terms from this point on interchangeably. There's two kinds of language assistance: interpretation and translation. The thing that I want you to understand is that there's a difference. People tend to use those interchangeably, but they mean different things, and the rules regarding each one are a little bit different. So interpretation is converting one language into another language verbally. Translation is the counterpart in writing. And again, because of my color choices, it's hard to see what's written at the bottom, but it says, what about gesturing and pantomiming or speaking louder and slower that we've all done? Those are not among the listed, what's listed as language assistance. We'll talk about them a little bit more, but I just want you to understand that I've heard people tell me that they explain some pretty complicated program requiremements to folks that are limited English proficient, and they did it without an interpreter, and they feel perfectly certain in themselves that in fact this client now understands completely what the obligations are that they might have to fulfill with regard to this federally assisted program that you are managing. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but I begun with my clients to talk about full spectrum language assistance. And that means that over to the far right, when you're dealing and you're managing federally assisted programs of one kind or another, you're dealing in a high-touch area where you need to apply high-touch kinds of solutions to language assistance. So those are things like translation and interpretation, and it costs a lot of money for this. However, you may be in a federally assisted housing project of one kind or another and managing that. That's a service that you provide. But there are parts of that interaction that you have with limited English proficient persons that may not always rise to the level of having to be high touch. You could be talking about the weather or asking somebody to, motioning to them, pantomiming for them to move their car. There's all kinds of things. You could be talking about kids. One of the things we'll talk about is a prohibition against using children, especially in a federal assisted setting. But if you're talking about the weather or you're talking about the kids and the child is interpreting, that's just fine. So there are things that are okay and there are things that aren't okay depending on the setting and the environment that you're working in. And that's the point of this slide. Is try to give people a little bit of comfort level in dealing with limited English proficiency. Essentially what the federal guidance, all the federal guidance for all the different agencies says is that you need to put in place a language assistance program. And a language assistance program has 6 main pieces to it. The first one is determining the needs. And that's called a language needs assessment. These are technical terms in the document, in the LEP guidance. You need to develop a plan. That's called a language access plan. These are both physical documents that you should be able to show anybody that comes looking to see what you are doing to address limited English proficiency in your federally assisted program, service, or housing. You need to train staff. You need to monitor what's working and not working. You need to evaluate whether you need to make changes. Do you need to translate documents into more languages? And then if you need to make a change to your plan, then you need to update your plan. Now you need to do this probably on at least an annual basis. And probably every 5 years you probably need to throw out everything and start over again because the demographics, the language needs in your market area may have changed. Basic rule is that you must provide interpretation. There is nothing, there is no what's called a safe harbor for this. If a person is assessed as being limited English proficient, and that person is trying to access those federally assisted programs and services that we talked about, then you must provide interpretation, and that interpretation has to have 3 characteristics. It must be competent, timely, and free. And not free to you, generally. It's expensive. This is expensive work. Interpretation and translation are expensive. Some interpreting cautions. We talked about children interpreting. If you're talking about eviction, a lease violation, some program non-compliance of some kind in your federally assisted program, you do not want to use children to do the interpretation. You may not want to use family and friends for all kinds of privacy reasons and so forth too. Now, it is possible, and I forgot to mention this yesterday, that you can ask somebody to bring an interpreter, but if that person does not bring an interpreter, it is your responsibility to provide that interpreter. And what are the 3 things that that interpretation has to be? Competent, timely, and free. Remember that there are different dialects, and when you're working with your interpreter, you may be dealing with the same language, but it's a different dialect. There is Mexican Spanish and there's Guatemalan Spanish. And sometimes that can be quite different, I understand. I speak one language. Yeah. Machine interpretation is something, and translation is something that's taking over. You hear more and more about it. Google, Microsoft, Yahoo are all buying up these interpretation and gadgets and so forth, apps that are available. It's bigger and bigger, and it's getting better and better. I don't know that it'll ever be perfect. Department of Justice does not consider machine translation or interpretation equivalent to human translation and interpretation. Yeah, did I say that right? But it's one of those things, again, remember that full spectrum of language assistance. There are probably points in there where you might be able to use that machine translation or interpretation to assist you. A lot of websites I see, and I encourage my clients to add the Google Translate gadget to their websites, so there at least is some option that a non-English speaker can have when they go on your website and try to find information. Now this would be also true of a public entity, a city, county, or state government, something to think about. And it's something that you can do before you pay for the full translation of a website. Remember, there's no safe harbor for interpretation. Now, translation is a little bit different. Remember, this is the written conversion of a document or documents from one language to another or other languages. These are the documents that help provide or offer meaningful access to that federally assisted program or service or housing. And since we're talking today about state and local governments, that is a plethora of documents. If you think about all the different places that that federal dollar hits in a local government, police, there's probably environmental grants of one kind or another. Just think of the multiple kinds of federal funding hit a community. So really, by now, most of these federal agencies have this guidance issued, and most city and county, local governments, state governments should have their language assistance programs in place. If you're a housing provider, things that come to mind as vital documents might be things like your website, where people are looking at your housing, the different locations and places that they might go to visit to, where they'd want to rent. It could be the application. It could be your selection criteria so that everybody can understand what the rules are. It could be your lease and many, many other documents. I'm going to guess that there's, when I deal with a client and a housing provider, there might be 15 documents, Wendell? Something like that? 15 documents at least that are considered vital documents. And probably in time there might be customized documents, say that there's a letter of some kind of a violation. That would be a vital document, but it might be a customized document of one kind or another, but it's still a vital document. HUD sets up and all the federal agencies set up what's called a safe harbor for translation. The expectation from the federal government is that you're not going to be compliant tomorrow with everything. Not all of your documents are going to be translated into all the languages that they should be translated into. And it also sets up thresholds depending on your service, the population, the languages in your service area, and your beneficiaries. If you read this, it talks about beneficiaries. Beneficiaries for a housing provider would be your tenants. So you have to look at, first of all, your market area, and then you also have to look at your tenant population. So if you're looking at your market area and you're hitting a threshold, you may have to change your marketing documents. But when you look at your tenant population and the language needs there, they may not hit these thresholds, so some of your documents that are related to occupancy may not have to be translated. So it's it's deceiving. It's kind of sophisticated. Now this is also true of, let's say, state and local governments. What are those documents that, remember those vital documents that might be affected here? Well, when I think of HUD, and I think of the HUD programs, I think of like public notices about meetings, about a project that's HUD funded, environmental publications. There's just a plethora of them. Is a traffic ticket from a police department, is that a vital document? Probably not to me if I didn't get it, but it might be to the person that got it. Who must comply? All agencies of the federal government, I mentioned that, and all programs that receive that federal assistance. So, state and local agencies. Just think of a state agency, how many places they have federal money coming into it. Their subrecipients, or the subrecipients of the federal government. And these can be for-profit and non-profit entities. They can be special districts such as fire, sewer, water districts. Now here's one that when I was doing this slide I thought of, and I wanted to mention to you, consultants. There's some rules in ADA, which I'm not presenting on today, but you essentially, if a city is having a private entity carry out one of its functions, essentially that entity has to comply with ADA. I'm going to say to you, remember I said I'm not an attorney and I have my own opinion about things, so I'm going to tell you this is my opinion. My opinion is that if you're having a consultant carry out one of your functions as a local or state government, that consultant better be compliant with the rules regarding limited English proficiency in Title VI, and that your contract with that consultant or those consultants should include those provisions. we'll talk about what some of those things might be. Let's talk about monitoring a little bit. Well, we know the feds are going to be monitoring, right? So they're going to be monitoring these grants that are given to state and local governments. They're also going to be, and the state and local governments are going to be monitoring their grantees and subrecipients. And the federal government is going to be monitoring to see if you're monitoring your subrecipients. So everybody's monitoring everybody. Yes, Amy? I apologize for those of you who are on the web listening to this, because I know that was dead air. Amy Howe from the U.S. Department of Justice just made a really important point. If you're a state, a recipient of these federal funds, and you're drawing money, you need to certify each time you draw these funds that you're complying with all of the rules, including Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and that if you certify and in fact you're not complying, that would be a false claim? If you're saying you're doing it and you're not doing it, that's a violation in itself, and there can be penalties that go along with that, including withdrawal of your funds. It's a lie. Amy said that. Now, in this process, I think one thing is forgotten, and actually I was going to cover this a little bit here. We sometimes forget about the ABCs in this whole thing about monitoring. And ABCs, in my mind, are advocates, beneficiaries, and citizens. And in fact, what Amy talked about is what I think others are going to talk about when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing in the Westchester case. I think that's going to come up today, right? Or not? Oh, we're not going to talk about Westchester? Oh, well, anyway, that's one of these cases, and you can look it up. But it has to do with a false certification. And, but, for instance, today when Christina talked about Section 3, remember she mentioned those regs that are out for comment right now? This is a chance for citizens and advocates and people that might benefit from Section 3 to make comments about those regs. Also, these same folks, these ABCs, can file lawsuits. They can file complaints. And just because you're a state or local agency, just like those homeowners associations maybe at one point felt like they were invulnerable to fair housing complaints and civil rights complaints, are finding that they, in fact, can be subjected to them, just the way a city or state, or I suppose even the federal government sometimes issues policies, and then a court case comes along and it changes how the federal government does what they do. And that's exactly what's happening with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules that are out for comment right now, or are being promulgated right now. I think the comment period is ended. Coverage. Boy, this is an interesting one to me. I don't know if it'll ever be tested, but it basically says if federal money is coming into one part of your operation, and all these rules that we're talking about on limited English proficiency in Title VI could affect another part of your organization that doesn't receive that federal money. For a state or local government where it has so many points that federal money is coming into, I think that this one is probably easier to understand because there are so many sources of federal money. In Idaho, the official language by law is English. And what the LEP guidance says is that's very nice, but your compliance with Title VI is going to be, in fact, judged by your compliance with the LEP guidance. So some focus areas, and again, this is basically directed to state and local governments. But your public participation plans, that's something that most of us in the housing side here probably don't even know what that is, but there's a rule that there has to be a public participation plan. And that public participation plan should address limited English proficiency. Environmental clearances and all the notices and publications that go out and for public hearings and so forth. Environmental justice is one of these things that kind of intertwines in a really odd way with limited English proficiency. Because while all those rules that I showed you about translation of documents, we can be in full compliance with those LEP rules, but let's just say you have a project that's affecting a community that's the predominant language is something other than English, but that project is going to affect primarily that community. And all the notices, all the public notices, all the hearings and so forth are either in English, they're published in Spanish or in another language in a newspaper that is only going to be read by English speakers, and there is no notification given to that particular community or that group of people that are affected. Again, this is Gary Haynes' opinion, but I think that you're running up against environmental justice kinds of issues, and that's environmental justice is beginning to play a bigger and bigger role. And you'll see it reflected in the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules. Davis-Bacon wage monitoring, that's one of the things that comes along, these cross-cutting requirements that comes along with this federal money, Community Development Block Grant and the home funding that we talked about earlier. Yes. Okay. All I'm going to say there is that that's a benefit for those people, workers on the job, to be paid a prevailing wage. And if you're not thinking about limited English proficiency and how you're going to deal with a limited English proficient worker in a way that's still confidential and safe for that person to tell you what, or tell somebody that's monitoring Davis-Bacon compliance, you're probably in violation of the Title VI rules. Section 3, again, not all the people that would qualify as Section 3 residents or businesses are English speakers. And if everything is provided, all the information is provided in English only, you're probably not compliant with the LEP rules. There's a lot of reasons to comply. I mentioned some of them yesterday. To improve community outreach, good customer service, comply with the law, to manage risk, and to avoid aggravation. I'm going to skip that one because we talked about it. This was a housing authority that ran amok on LEP. I want to talk about a state that ran amok. State of Nebraska in 2014 was basically called to order by HUD for not complying with the LEP rules. And this particular department in the state of Nebraska managed the CDBG and home programs. Essentially what they had to do is enter into that voluntary compliance agreement that was talked about by Christina. They had to do a language assistance program which included that language needs assessment, the language access plan. They had to give notice to subrecipients, train their subrecipients, and monitor their subrecipients. And the difference was, instead of the state of Nebraska doing this on their schedule, now they're going to be doing it on HUD's schedule. There are a lot of resources. LEP.gov, the Department of Justice website, is really a great resource. I want to direct you to my website. I have a lot of resources there, especially for housing providers. We just rolled out Language Finder, which is a language identification poster in the that you can put in your tablet or in your smartphone. I also want to suggest that if you have a chance to go to my website, to click on the LinkedIn and connect to my LinkedIn business profile. I publish little articles in there every once in a while about limited English proficiency and language. Nelson Mandela: if you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. If you talk to him in a language if you talk to him in his language, it goes to his heart. And that's kind of the thought I wanted to leave you with today. And that's all I have. Am I in? Yes, Eric. Yeah. Eric Kingston is pointing out that on Idaho fairhousingforum.org that you can, there's a search box there, you can type in Westchester and find information about that situation. And for cities and counties, you can just type in city or county and find information that would be relevant to city and county governments. The comment is that really a question about many different dialects, Spanish dialects, and the application form and how to address that. Well, what I would do is I would be addressing that if I was managing federally assisted housing of some kind. I would be addressing that by stating how I was going to deal with that in my language access plan. And I would be talking to people that do this professionally, interpret and translate documents to find out how to address that best. And it may mean that you have to provide it in those different dialects because it's supposed to be competent. The way interpretation is supposed to be competent, the translation is also supposed to be competent. But you can also interpret a written document. So there are ways to assist a person as well that way. It's all expensive and it's all difficult, but there are people out there that can help you. And I don't know, maybe Intermountain Fair Housing Council can also direct you to assistance for that too.
On the City of Boise's web, some of you, if you go to the City of Boise, some of you have just a short statement that says this is an important notice, and it's translated in many different languages. Please, please, please at least have that. But you must know that you probably, if you're receiving federal funds, critical documents at least need to be translated in Spanish, but you need to go through this language needs assessment and do a language access plan, because if you aren't trying to comply and do the best that you can, it's not just Title VI, it's also Title VIII if you're offering different terms and conditions. So go to your local resources. We're one, but there's also other community groups that can provide you with resources to interpreters, both free and those who will charge. But you want to make sure, as Gary said, that they're competent.
Sarah?
Yeah, interpreters.com. But Gary has a lot of these resources on his page. And also HUD has a very wonderful website for publications in multiple languages. So if you have never looked at HUD's website, they have a whole section with things in different languages, all sorts of these types of notices and publications you're required to have if you're federally assisted. Okay, good. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the clarification, right? So typically, if you have one of these I Speak cards, they can look at it and point to their language, and it will be in their language and in English, so you know who to call for a language assistance phone number to call an interpreter, or to call someone locally. So I would go to Gary's website or just Google I Speak, and if you look at the I Speak, it will have on there sometimes up to 150, 200 languages, where it will be on, if you put it right on your desk, sorry for people on the web, if you look on the desk, they can point to it. It will have their language, and it will have it in English. And then you can call the language line, and the language line, usually what the language service will do is it will give you free instruction on how to use it, so that each time you go in, what Gary said is be trained on this, is that you know how to use the language assistance line. Once they have, these are free documents online, once you look at the I Speak, they point to it, you know to call the interpreter. They will connect you to an interpreter who speaks that language. If you have a specific dialect or something unusual, they can tell you the period of time it will take. It may mean that you'll have to wait a few minutes to get somebody who's competent in that. But really, it is about using your best efforts, and I'm sure HUD would tell you that as well. It's about trying to get someone to help this person as best you can, and that there are some difficult situations where we have people who speak very few people speak that language, but trying to do the best that you can is the best practice. And please contact us or Gary or your other resources in the community, because we'd be happy to connect you with those resources. Yeah. So the question was, is there a cost to the I Speak service or the interpretation service? Yes, there is. And what we've suggested is if there is some way when you apply for that federal funding to put that cost, we put that cost into our grants. We're federal recipients. We have to comply. And I would make sure that if there's some way we can pool those resources, if you're not getting the access to that you talk to the community about other ways you might have access to interpretation. So those are some things to think about if you can pool your resources. If there's something through your landlord-tenant association or your city association, or some of you small cities I know have a difficult time, but some of those pooling of resources are critical. So sorry, I don't mean to dominate the.
A great resource in most of our communities that may not work for the really important documents because they may not be considered competent or certified, but they'll get you by in a pinch. It's your churches, especially those of the Mormon faith. Many of them have gone on missions to other countries, and many of them speak another language. It's not a guarantee, but it's a resource you might be able to tap into. It's for those, we need to get into your apartment. It's the simple things, not the you're being evicted. Please do not use that for evictions. That is not what I'm saying. It's the we're going to enter and replace the furnace type of thing. They may be able to help you. Your local universities, your colleges, community colleges, they may have a language class that might be able to help you with some of the simple, non-vital stuff. I'm not saying for vital, oh goodness. We are going to go to a break. We're going to go for 10 minutes. Sorry, we're shortening this a bit so that we can get through the last part. So be back at 3 o'clock, please.